My nephew sleeping in his room. Infidelity story. The house was enveloped in silence, the darkness cloaking every corner. Lolita moved cautiously down the hallway towards her nephew Adam's room, her heart racing with adrenaline. She was acutely aware that her actions were inappropriate, yet the anticipation of what she was about to do intensified her desire. The undeniable attraction that had developed between them was palpable. Each shared glance and accidental brush of skin had created an unbearable tension. Tonight, she resolved not to resist any longer. With a gentle push, she opened the door, holding her breath as she peered inside. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the soft moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting shadows across the bed where Adam lay. He appeared serene, sprawled on his back with one arm casually resting above his head, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Lolita's gaze lingered on him, her pulse quickening as she absorbed every detail, the strong contours of his shoulders, the way his shirt clung to his form, and the faint stubble along his jawline. She bit her lip, battling the urge to retreat, but a deeper, primal instinct kept her rooted in place. Her eyes traced the outline of his body beneath the sheets, and a wave of heat surged through her. There was no turning back now. Quietly, she stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She paused at the foot of the bed, simply observing him for a moment before carefully climbing onto the mattress. As she settled beside him, she leaned in closer, her breath warm against his ear as she whispered his name, Adam. Her voice was low and seductive. He stirred slightly, turning his head in her direction, yet remained asleep. Lolita's heart raced with exhilaration. The thrill of witnessing him in this vulnerable state sent shivers down her spine. She lowered herself further, her lips hovering just inches from his cheek, and pressed a delicate kiss against his skin. He murmured softly in his sleep. In the stillness of his slumber, he murmured softly, his lips parting as if in response to her gentle caress. Lolita's breath caught in her throat as she traced her lips along his jawline, her kisses becoming bolder as she descended to his neck. The warmth of his skin beneath her mouth and the faint scent that enveloped him sent her senses reeling. Unable to resist, she slid her hand up his chest, her fingers teasingly outlining the contours of his muscles. He stirred slightly, a frown creasing his brow, yet he remained asleep. Encouraged, Lolita leaned in closer, her body pressing lightly against his as she kissed the side of his neck, her tongue flicking out to taste him. The sensation elicited a shudder from him, his breathing faltering, and she smiled against his skin. Adam, she whispered, her voice a sultry murmur, wake up. His eyes fluttered open slowly, still clouded with sleep, and he blinked up at her, confusion evident in his gaze as he attempted to comprehend the situation. Aunt Lolita, he murmured, his voice thick and groggy, what are you? But before he could finish, she silenced him with a kiss, soft and tender at first, then deepening into something more demanding. Adam stiffened, his eyes widening in shock, yet Lolita did not withdraw. She could feel his body responding to her, sensing how his initial hesitation began to dissipate as his lips began to move against hers. It's okay, she whispered, breaking the kiss just long enough to murmur against his mouth, her hands cupping his face. Just let me, just this once. Adam let out a low, helpless groan, his hands instinctively gripping her waist as if he were unable to resist. Lolita interpreted this as her signal to intensify the kiss, channeling all her pent-up longing into the embrace. His initial resistance began to fade, and soon his hands were exploring her body, gliding up her back and tangling in her hair, drawing her nearer as he reciprocated. With an equal fervor. Lolita's heart raced as she sensed him shift beneath her, his body arching to meet hers, the heat radiating from him causing her to gasp softly. Unable to restrain herself, she began to grind against him, her movements deliberate and sensual. Adam's grip on her hips tightened, a desperate sound escaping his lips as he buried his face in her neck, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Aunt Lolita, we shouldn't, he murmured, his voice strained, but his protest was drowned out as she kissed him again, her tongue slipping past his lips to intertwine with his. He groaned, his hands sliding down to her thighs, and Lolita shivered as his touch sent waves of electricity coursing through her. Don't think, she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear, just feel, before kissing him once more. Her hands roamed over his body, as if trying to memorize every detail, and she felt him shudder beneath her, responding to her touch, which only emboldened her further. Gradually, she slipped her hand beneath his shirt, her fingers gliding over his bare skin, prompting a low, helpless moan from him. "Lolita," he breathed, his voice a strained whisper, yet he did not push her away. Instead, his hands began to explore her body, initially hesitant but growing more assured as he recognized her willingness. Lolita arched against him, her breath escaping in soft, breathless gasps as his hand traveled up her sides, his fingers lightly brushing over her ribs. The sensation of his touch made her head spin, and she leaned down, her lips trailing over his collarbone, her tongue flicking out to taste him. Adam's hands tightened around her waist, his body trembling beneath her, and Lolita found herself unable to resist pressing closer, her hips moving against his in a slow, sensual rhythm. "Aunt Lolita, please," he groaned, his voice filled with desperation. It was unclear whether he was pleading for her to cease or to continue, but Lolita was resolute. She could not stop. Now. Not when he felt so incredible beneath her, not when she could sense his body responding to her every move. Slowly, Lolita pressed her lips back to his, her hands gliding over his chest as she kissed him deeply and passionately. Adam moaned into her mouth, his hands exploring her body, causing Lolita to shiver as his touch sent tingles down her spine. This was undeniably wrong, yet in that moment, she felt indifferent to the consequences. All that mattered was the pleasure he brought her. Lolita's heart raced as she felt Adam's lips part beneath hers, his resistance dissipating entirely. His hands traveled over her back, slipping under her shirt and brushing against her skin, eliciting a soft gasp from her lips. She deepened the kiss, her tongue intertwining with his as she pressed her body closer, feeling the warmth radiating through the thin fabric of his clothing. She could sense his uncertainty, the slight tremor in his fingers as they explored her curves. However, each time he attempted to pull away, even momentarily, Lolita captured his mouth again, kissing him with increasing fervor until he was left breathless and quivering beneath her. The taste of him was intoxicating, igniting a wild need within her, and she could not restrain her hands from wandering. She slid her fingers to the hem of his shirt, lifting it to reveal the smooth skin of his abdomen. "Adam," she murmured against his lips, her voice low and sultry, "I've desired this for so long." He shuddered, his breath escaping in a ragged gasp as Lolita leaned down, her lips trailing along his neck. She felt his pulse racing beneath her mouth, sensed the tension in his body as her hands roamed over him, caressing every inch of exposed skin. He was so warm, so strong, and the sensation of him, the taste of him, made her head spin. "Aunt Lolita, we can't," he whispered, his voice strained, yet the way his hands tightened around her waist and the arch of his body betrayed his true feelings. The manner in which his hands gripped her waist, and his body arched against hers conveyed a different narrative. He truly did not want her to cease. "Do not resist," she murmured, her lips grazing his ear. "Allow yourself to feel," she urged, kissing him once more. Her hands traveled up his chest, lifting his shirt until he raised his arms, permitting her to remove it entirely. Lolita cast it aside, her gaze darkening as she absorbed the sight of him, his broad shoulders, the sculpted muscles of his chest and abdomen, and the way his skin shimmered softly in the moonlight. He was stunning, every part of him, and she found herself drawn in, leaning down to let her lips lightly caress his collarbone before descending to kiss her way down his chest. Adam groaned, his hands entwining in her hair as she continued to kiss him, his body quaking under her touch. Lolita smiled against his skin, her tongue tracing the contours of his muscles, relishing the way he responded with shivers. She kissed lower, reaching his stomach, her hands gliding over his sides and feeling the tension of his muscles beneath her fingers. "Aunt Lolita, please," he murmured, his voice a breathless entreaty, yet Lolita persisted, kissing her way back up, her hands exploring his chest and shoulders before sliding down to his hips as she straddled him, their bodies pressing together in a manner that elicited gasps from both. "Does this feel wrong?" she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear as she rocked her hips against him, the slow, sensual motion prompting a soft groan from him. "I don't know," he stammered, his hands gripping her waist, torn between drawing her closer and pushing her away. "Just let go," Lolita urged, her voice low and enticing. She leaned down, capturing his lips in a deep, lingering kiss, her hands moving to cradle his face as she kissed him repeatedly, each kiss growing more fervent and desperate. Adam's resistance shattered entirely. He returned her kiss with an intensity that matched her own, his hands sliding up her back, pulling her closer as he rolled them over, pinning her beneath him. As he maneuvered her beneath him, Lolita gasped softly, her heart racing at the intensity of his gaze, which was dark and filled with an unfamiliar desire. "Aunt Lolita, I can't stop," he murmured, his voice low and raw. "Then don't," she whispered in response, her hands tangling in his hair. He kissed her again, his mouth hot and demanding against hers, while his hands roamed over her body, exploring her as if he were desperate to know every part of her. Lolita arched beneath him, trembling as his hands slid down to her thighs, pushing her skirt up, his fingers brushing lightly against her bare skin. "Adam," she gasped softly, gripping his shoulders as he kissed his way down her neck, his lips trailing over her collarbone and lower. The sensation of his mouth on her skin, combined with the heat of his body pressed against hers, was nearly overwhelming. Each touch and kiss sent electric jolts through her, making her head spin. "I want you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as her hands slid down his back, pulling him closer. Adam groaned, his grip tightening on her thighs as he kissed her again, his mouth hot and insistent. Lolita could feel the tension building between them, the way his body responded to hers only intensifying her desire. She slid her hands to the waistband of his pants, her fingers trembling slightly as she began to unbutton them, her heart pounding wildly. "Adam," she murmured again, her voice breathless and low. He looked down at her, his eyes dark and intense, and for a moment, they remained still. Then, slowly, he leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was soft and tender, causing her heart to ache. "I want you too," he whispered back, his voice strained, before kissing her again, his hands caressing her body as if he could never get enough. Lolita's breath hitched as his hands moved lower, his touch sending shivers down her spine, and she arched against him, her body trembling with anticipation. Lolita's breath caught as his hands descended, his touch igniting a cascade of shivers along her spine. She arched into him, her body quivering with anticipation. When his fingers finally grazed her most sensitive area, she gasped, her hands clutching his shoulders as a wave of pleasure washed over her. "Adam," she moaned softly, her voice a desperate entreaty. In that moment, everything else faded into oblivion, the world, the consequences, leaving only the sensation of his touch and the feelings he evoked within her. Nothing else held significance. All that mattered was their entangled forms in a forbidden embrace, their bodies moving in perfect harmony as they surrendered to the desire that had long been simmering between them.